remember the exact moment the Hive decided I was wrong. Not because a judge spoke my name, or because a weapon was raised against me, but because a piece of paper was nailed into a wall that had already forgotten how many notices it had held before. The bulkhead outside Hab Corridor 17 had always been a place of minor announcements, shift adjustments, devotional attendance reminders, ration recalibrations after shortages that never ended. The metal there was soft with age, layered in rust like scabbed skin. 3 rivets held the proclamation in place, driven through parchment and into iron with ceremonial care. The hammer strikes still echoed faintly in my ears when I first stopped to read it. The wax seal was already running. It drooped like a wounded thing, crimson softened by the Hive's constant heat, bleeding into the fibers of the page. Someone had pressed the seal too hard, as if trying to make certain it stayed attached long enough to damn us. The ink beneath it was blocky and official. The letters measured, spaced according to regulation. My eyes followed them without comprehension at first, trained by years of reading orders that never asked for consent. Note IC over the STEIAUN below that, smaller text, jurisdiction codes, subsector authority. Reference numbers so long they wrapped to the next line, as if the crime itself required length to justify its existence. Then the designation of our home, rendered in the cold language of ledgers and maps. Hab Block K-19 crossed out, Hab Block 17. The correction was done by hand. The original designation struck through with a single ink line, precise and unapologetic. Whoever corrected it hadn't bothered to realign the text. The mistake was visible, permanent, a quiet admission that even condemnation could be misfiled before it was finalized. That detail stayed with me more than anything else. We were almost spared by error. Almost. I could hear the Hive breathing around me as I stood there. Ventilation fans rattled overhead, pushing recycled air that tasted faintly of oil and copper. Somewhere below, machinery groaned through another endless cycle. The sound carried upward through the bones of the structure. The corridor smelled of boiled recyc, water from the communal taps, mingled with the soreness of too many people living too close together for too long. Sweat, old food, ozone from lumen, strips that flickered and hummed like dying insects. I wasn't alone. Others had gathered, pretending not to read too closely, pretending not to understand. In the Hive, attention is dangerous. To stop too long is to be noticed, and to be noticed is to be recorded. A woman from the lower bunks crossed herself with trembling fingers, whispering a fragment of catechism under her breath. A pair of manufacturum laborers stood shoulder to shoulder, helmets still tucked under their arms, grease staining their cuffs. One of them laughed, a short bark of sound, and said it was just another clerical sweep. They always do this before quota season, he muttered. Scare us straight. Census, maybe. Reclassification. I wanted to believe him. The Imperium teaches you to hope in small, sanctioned ways. Hope that your ration chit will be accepted. Hope that the overseer won't notice you limping. Hope that the lumen strip outside your door won't finally die during the night. Hope that the word heretical will apply to someone else. But the final line was impossible to misread. Heretical. The word contamination sat heavier than the rest. It implied spread, infection. It meant the problem wasn't an act, but proximity. It meant guilt could be breathed in, absorbed through walls, passed along by shared tools and recycled air. I felt an irrational urge to step away from the notice, as if distance might protect me, as if words could radiate danger. Behind me, someone whispered, "That can't be right." Another voice answered, quieter, "It's always right. They wouldn't post it if it wasn't." That was the cruelty of it. The notice didn't accuse a person. It accused a place, our place. The rooms where we slept stacked like cargo. The corridors where children played with broken machine parts and called it a game. The shrines we passed every morning, their icons worn smooth by generations of fingers. To declare a Hive block heretical was to say the walls themselves had erred. I went back into my Hab unit after that, closing the door with more care than usual. The locking mechanism stuck, as it always did, metal teeth grinding against each other before finally catching. Inside, the space felt smaller than it had that morning. My bunk, my footlocker, the tiny shelf where I kept a devotional slate and a chipped cup, all of it seemed suddenly temporary, already reassigned in some distant ledger. I sat on the edge of the bunk and listened. Voices carried through the thin walls, arguments starting, stopping, a child crying until someone hushed them too sharply. The public vox crackled to life somewhere down the corridor, issuing a routine reminder about work attendance, its tone cheerful in the way only machines can be when they do not understand context. No mention yet of the noticed, no instructions, just the usual lies of normalcy. That was when the fear truly set in, not as panic, but as weight. The Imperium does not move quickly for our sake. It moves deliberately for its own. A posted notice meant the process had already begun elsewhere, in offices far above us, where robed figures bent over desks carved with prayers and scratch marks. It meant forms had been filled, countersigned, stamped. It meant we had already been discussed in rooms we would never see, reduced to statistics and risk assessments. The notice was not the beginning. It was the courtesy of informing us that the end was now official. I tried to pray. The words felt dry in my mouth, memorized syllables recited without confidence. I asked the Emperor for clarity, for correction, for the kind of mercy that might look like a clerical error discovered in time. The only response was the steady vibration of the hive and the distant clang of something heavy being moved into position. Later, when the corridor lights dimmed to their night cycle, I went back to the bulkhead. The notice was still there, the wax seal sagging further, a slow drip congealing at the bottom edge of the parchment. Someone had tried to scrape it off. I could see the scratch marks, frantic and shallow. They hadn't succeeded. The rivets held. I stood there a long time, committing the wording to memory, as if knowing it precisely might grant me some control over what was coming. I did not yet understand how thorough the Imperium could be when it decided to be clean. I only knew that my home had been labeled, and labels, once applied, were never removed, only acted upon. That night, the hive felt like it was holding its breath, and so was I. The first shutter fell at dawn, if you can call it dawn in a hive where the sky is a ceiling of soot, stained plates, and the sun is a rumor spoken only by off-worlders and priests. The lumen, strips along Hab Corridor 17 brightened to their work cycle, setting, washing the walls in sickly white. The air tasted the same as always, boiled metal, recycled water, the faint chemical bite of antiseptic that never quite erased the stench of bodies. For a moment, I believed we might go to our shifts as usual, file into the transit shafts, surrender our hours to the manufacturer and return with our ration chits stamped and our backs bent. Then the hive coughed. It began as a tremor in the floor, an irregular vibration, like a machine struggling to engage a gear that had rusted to its teeth. The ventilation grates along the ceiling rattled, and a gust of stale air belched out, warm and sour, carrying with it flecks of dust that glittered in the lumen light. Somewhere deeper in the structure, something huge moved. The sound rolled through the corridor like thunder trapped inside iron, a long metallic groan, followed by the slam of mass meeting mass. People froze in their doorways. A child stopped mid-step, a scrap of wire toy dangling from their hand. I felt it through my boots, through my bones, the hive shifting its internal organs. Another slam. Closer this time. I walked to the corner where the corridor opened toward the main stairwell, and I saw it. The quarantine gate descending from its housing like a guillotine blade. It was a slab of armored metal, with hazard chevrons, faded by decades and a purity, script etched into its surface so deeply the letters looked like scars. As it dropped, it shaved flakes of old paint from the frame, and the smell of disturbed rust rose sharp and bitter. It hit the floor with a finality that made the air jump. For a heartbeat, there was silence, real silence, not the usual hive hum. Even the ventilation seemed to pause, as if waiting to see what we would do. Then the locks engaged. Thick bolts slammed into place with a staccato rhythm, and the gate's seams glowed briefly with heat as machine spirits accepted their orders. Someone screamed. Not a dramatic scream, not the kind you hear in sermons about damnation, but a raw animal sound that broke the spell of stillness. Others rushed toward the gate, hands outstretched, as if they could pry it open by force of desperation. Their palms slapped metal. It did not even tremble. A voice crackled from an overhead speaker, one of the public vox units that usually dispensed shift hymns and ration reminders. Its tone was calm, carefully modulated, the voice of a machine trained to soothe. It spoke as if addressing a minor inconvenience. Attention, residents of Hab, Block K, 17. By decree of authorized officers, quarantine protocols are now in effect. Remain within assigned habitation zones. Compliance is mandatory. Non-compliance will be recorded. Recorded. That word was worse than threatened. Threats implied emotion. Recording implied procedure. I turned and ran back down the corridor, not because I thought I could escape, but because my body rejected the sight of the gate like a reflex. As I moved, I heard more shutters falling in the distance, echoing slams that answered each other through the Hive's arteries. We were being sealed like a contaminated container, locked from every rote that mattered. I pictured a clerk's hand drawing a line through our block on a map, enclosing it in a neat square. A problem isolated. The ventilation system, already sickly, began to labor. The fans changed pitch, their constant rattle becoming a wet, irregular cough. Air that had always been thin now felt thicker, clotted with heat. The smell of oil grew stronger, and with it the sensation of being breathed by something old and unwell. I watched dust accumulate on the vent grates in real time, as if the Hive was shedding its skin. Then the Arbites arrived. You never hear them first. You hear what comes with them, the synchronized stamp of booted feet, the faint whine of powered armor servers, the click of weapon safeties in practiced hands. They entered our corridor like a procession of law given physical form, black carapace plates reflecting the lumen strips in dull flashes. Each wore a rebreather mask, the filters large and clinical, as if the air around us was already poison. Their visors were blank. It was a mercy in a way. No eyes to plead with. No human face to convince. They did not shout. They did not bark orders like the overseers at the manufactorum. They moved with ritual patience, unfolding equipment with the care of surgeons. One carried a canister of paint, thick, bright, the kind used to mark hazard zones and condemned equipment. Another held a stencil plate, inscribed with an imperial warning sigil. They stopped at the first doorway and worked without hesitation. The painter pressed the stencil to the metal and sprayed in slow arcs. The hiss of paint sounded like an insect's breath. When he removed the stencil, the warning sigil remained a stark symbol of containment, surrounded by tiny scripture lines that blurred into unreadable devotion. The fresh paint stank, sharp enough to bite the nose even through my own cheap respirator. It was the smell of finality, of something being officially altered. Door after door received the mark. Each stroke was slow, ritualistic, indifferent. The Arbites did not look at the residents watching from shadows. They did not acknowledge the whispered prayers, the sobs. We were not people to them in that moment. We were units in a quarantined ledger. A woman stepped forward, clutching her ration chit in both hands as if it were a sacred relic. My child needs food, she pleaded, voice cracking. We have no reserves. Please, this must be a mistake. The Arbites closest to her turned his helmet slightly. For a moment I thought he might speak. Instead, he raised a small device, an identification slate, and scanned her chit. The device beeped once, then displayed something only he could see. He handed the chit back without touching her fingers, using the edge of the slate like a tool to avoid contact. Pending purity review, he said. His voice was muffled by the rebreather, stripped of warmth. It sounded like a man reading aloud from a manual he did not believe in. That phrase, pending purity review, began to spread like disease through the block. It was stamped onto ration requests, scribbled onto petition forms, spoken by enforcers when asked any question they did not intend to answer. The ration station, normally a place of grinding misery, became something worse. Before quarantine, you could at least stand in line and count the minutes until your portion of protein paste was dispensed. Now the station's hatch remained closed, a metal mouth sealed tight. A small slot opened briefly to accept ration chits, and when the slot closed again, you heard the churn of machinery and the scratch of something stamping. Denied, delayed, pending purity review. The chits came back through the slot marked with red ink or punched holes that rendered them invalid. Some were returned untouched, as if the system had refused even to acknowledge the request. People stared at their own papers like they had been handed death certificates. The public vox repeated its calm instructions every hour. remain within assigned habitation zones, do not congregate, maintain devotional compliance, report suspicious behavior. The voice never changed, never showed strain. It was like listening to metal being filed, de-steadied, dry, eroding. Sweat pooled under my collar. The corridor grew hotter as bodies stayed inside. The air thickened, heavy with unwashed fear. Every sound became louder. The scrape of boots, the clink of prayer beads, the faint sobbing behind thin walls. I began to notice the Hive's minor failures with new intensity. The lumen strip that flickered too quickly, the pipe that dripped rust water in a steady rhythm, the way the walls seemed to vibrate as if something far larger was shifting. In the afternoon, the second gate fell, the one that led to the upper transit shaft. Its slam was muffled by distance, but we felt it anyway, the vibration traveling through the floor. By then, no one rushed to fight it. We had learned already that metal would not yield to hands. We had learned, too, that the Hive obeyed the paperwork, not our need. I returned to my hab unit with my ration chit still unmarked, rejected without explanation. The devotional slate on my shelf seemed to watch me. Its etched icon was worn smooth from my fingers, and yet I could not find comfort in it. I tried to recite the litany of endurance, but the words tasted like dust. That evening, I heard a neighbor in the next unit arguing with someone, his wife, perhaps, or his own conscience. "We did nothing," he kept saying. "We did nothing." But the quarantine did not care about doing. It cared about being. Being in the wrong block, under the wrong designation, beneath the wrong line in the ledger. That was the first law of heresy we learned. Though no priest spoke it aloud, you do not need to commit it to be contained by it. When night cycle came, the Arbites did not leave. They set up a small station at the corridor junction, portable barriers, a cogitator unit, a standing lamp that cast hard shadows. They stood there like statues of authority, breathing through filters, watching our marked doors with patient certainty. I lay in my bunk and listened to the ventilation coughing. The Hive's breath was hot and stale, and I could not shake the sensation that we were sealed inside something that had already decided to purge us. Somewhere beyond the shutters, life continued, work shifts, prayers, quotas. The rest of the Hive would not even feel our absence yet. We were simply a section of machinery shut down for maintenance. I stared at the ceiling and imagined the notice outside, its wax seal melting a little more each hour, the parchment slowly curling at the edges. Heat and time working together to erase the last traces of softness. In the dark, I realized something I had never permitted myself to think before. If we were truly heretical, if contamination had truly been declared, then the quarantine was not meant to protect us from the outside. It was meant to protect the outside from us. They arrived without ceremony, which somehow made it worse. There was no announcement from the Vox, no trumpet of authority, no warning bell to prepare us for judgment. One moment the corridor was thick with the low murmur of hungry people conserving breath, and the next it filled with strangers in grey and rust, red robes, their hems brushing grime that would never wash out. They moved in pairs and trios, not with the martial certainty of the Arbites, but with the quiet confidence of those who knew the paperwork was already on their side. Adepts, we called them, though that word implies devotion. These were functionaries, extensions of the Imperium's memory made flesh. Their faces were pale from lumen, light and sealed rooms, their eyes ringed with fatigue that had long ago curdled into indifference. Each carried a cogitator slate cradled like an infant, data cables trailing from its spine to ports embedded in their own wrists or temples. When they walked, you could hear the soft clicking of internal counters advancing. The public Vox finally spoke, its tone unchanged. "Attention. Audit procedures are now commencing. Prepare all relevant documentation for review. Failure to comply will be noted. Not punished. Noted." That word echoed through me like a nail driven into bone. We were herded into lines along the corridor walls, arranged by unit number, not by family or age. The floor was cold through the thin soles of my boots, the metal leaching warmth from my feet, as if to remind me that comfort was a privilege, not a right. Lumen strips flickered overhead, some stuttering fast enough to make my eyes ache. The smell of incense lingered faintly from the previous day's markings, mixing with sweat and fear into something sour and sacred at the same time. The first questions were deceptively simple. State your full name as recorded. State your labor designation. State your place of birth, if known. I answered automatically, the way I always did when dealing with overseers or clerks. My name came out clean, unbroken. My designation matched the one stamped on my work chit. My place of birth, another Hive level, long since reassigned and renamed. Earned a pause as the Adept cross referenced it against something unseen. That pause was everything. I could hear the scratch of a stylus somewhere, the faint electronic chirr of the cogitator recalculating. My mouth went dry. I resisted the urge to explain further, to justify details no one had asked for. In the Imperium, excess explanation is confession, lineage documentation, the Adept said at last, without looking up. I handed over the thin bundle of papers I kept folded inside my jacket, copies of work assignments, a baptismal stamp from a shrine whose iconography had since been updated, a faded proof of citizenship slate with my thumbprint half worn away. Papers I had never once needed to present all at the same time until now. The Adept took them with gloved fingers and fed each page into a portable scanner, the machine swallowing my history one sheet at a time. As it worked, another Adept stepped forward, his voice softer, almost conversational. Daily devotional compliance, he asked. Yes, I said quickly. Morning and end shift. Which litany? I hesitated, just a fraction of a second. The pause was unintentional, but it felt like standing on the edge of a pit. The litany of endurance, I answered. Standard cycle. His fingers stopped moving. There was a revision issued 2 years ago, he said mildly. Which verse was added? My mind scrambled. I knew there had been changes, there were always changes. But whether they applied to my sector, my block, my shrine, I recited the verse I knew, my voice growing quieter as I spoke. The Adept listened without expression, then nodded once and marked something on his slate. Acceptable, he said. Not correct. Acceptable. I was waved aside, directed to stand against the opposite wall beneath a flickering lumen strip. Relief washed through me, followed immediately by shame at feeling it, while others still waited. I watched as neighbors stepped forward, one by one, offering up their lives in fragments of ink and memory. A man from the lower levels could not produce a devotional record older than 5 years. The shrine where he'd been registered had collapsed during a structural failure, its archives lost. He tried to explain, voice rising with each sentence, hands shaking as if motion alone could summon proof. The Adepts listened politely, then marked his slate with a yellow sigil. Anomalous, one said. 2 Arbites stepped forward at once, their boots loud in the suddenly silent corridor. They took the man by the arms, not roughly, but firmly, and guided him away toward a service stairwell. He looked back once, eyes wide and wet, and opened his mouth as if to say something to us. An Arbite's shock maul crackled softly. The man closed his mouth and went without a sound. That was when the corridor became a chapel, not in design, but in behavior. People lowered their heads, hands clasped, prayers mouthed without sound. We learned quickly that attention invited inquiry, and inquiry invited removal. The flicker of the lumen strips took on a rhythmic quality, like candles guttering in a draught. Every cough sounded like blasphemy. The audit continued for hours. Adepts asked for work shift attestations signed by overseers long since rotated off-world. They asked for proof of tethers paid to shrines that had merged, split, or been rededicated under new doctrinal guidance. They asked for names of co-workers, neighbors, anyone who could verify consistency. Each name spoken was entered into a slate, branching outward like rot through wood. I realized then that this was not an inspection meant to confirm purity. It was a net. One woman ahead of me, a hab cleaner with arthritic hands, kept apologizing as she fumbled her documents, her fingers too stiff to separate the pages quickly. An adept finally sighed and took the papers from her, scanning them with brisk efficiency. "Your devotional attendance shows a 3-day absence," he said. "My joints," she whispered. "I could not walk, I prayed at home." "I's home prayer is not recorded," the adept replied. "Deviation noted." "Please," she said. "I have served all my life." He stamped her chit with red ink so hard the paper tore. "Under review," he said, and handed it back like trash. When they reached the end of the corridor, they turned and began again, this time with different questions. variations on the same theme, designed to test consistency, to invite contradiction. By the third pass, people were exhausted, dehydrated, hollow-eyed. Answers began to slip. Timelines blurred. The same truth told twice did not sound the same. That was enough. I watched as more neighbors were marked, tagged, led away. Each removal left a gap in the line, a silence that pressed inward from both sides. No one asked where they were taken. We all knew better than to ask questions that required answers. By the time the adepts finally withdrew, the corridor floor was littered with discarded paper scraps and smears of red ink. The air felt heavier than ever, thick with the residue of judgment. My own status remained uncertain, no stamp, no mark, just a small symbol on a slate I would never see. As they left, one adept paused near the shuttered gate and made a note about population adjustment. He said it the way a manufacturing clerk might note a shortfall in materials. I leaned my head against the wall and closed my eyes, feeling the cold metal seep into my skin. I understood then that the audit was not about faith or loyalty or even guilt. It was about alignment, about whether a life fit cleanly into the Imperium's columns, and if it did not, it would be removed until the numbers balanced. When night cycle came, the corridor was quieter than it had ever been. Too many voices were missing. I lay awake, listening to the Hive's labored breathing, and wondered how many more passes it would take before my own answers failed to match themselves. Because sooner or later, everyone contradicts. The clerics came after the clerks, just as rot follows a wound that has been measured and declared viable. By then, the corridor no longer felt like a place people lived. It had become a holding space, an antechamber to judgment, its walls marked with warning sigils and inked annotations like a body covered in diagnostic notes. The air was thick enough to chew. Every breath scraped my throat, heavy with sweat, fear, and the lingering chemical tang of the audit devices. Sleep had become shallow and fractured, interrupted by the sounds of boots, coughs, and the occasional muffled cry from somewhere deeper in the block. When the incense came, it arrived before the clerics did. A sweet, cloying smoke seeped through the corridor, curling out from portable censers carried by unseen hands. It was the kind of incense reserved for funerary rites and rededications, heavy with resin and sanctified oils, meant to mask unpleasant realities beneath layers of approved reverence. It coated the tongue and burned the eyes, forcing tears that looked suspiciously like grief. Beneath it, the smell of fear did not vanish. It only changed shape, trapped under holiness like a body wrapped for burial. The public vox crackled, adjusted its tone downward, and began to chant, "Kneel." Not a request, not a suggestion. Kneel in preparation for purification. All residents will assume a posture of reverence. Compliance is mandatory. The floor was filthy, smeared with old grease and new ink, but we knelt anyway. Knees pressed into metal, into grit, into the cold reminders of how little the Hive cared for flesh. I felt the ache immediately, sharp and blooming, but I welcomed it. Pain, at least, was simple. Pain could be endured. They entered in formation. Clerics in layered robes of ash, white and red, marched between squads of armed purity troopers, their boots striking the floor in perfect synchronization. Each step sent a vibration through the corridor, a measured rhythm that made my teeth buzz. Their faces were hidden behind devotional masks, stylized visages of stern saints and abstracted symbols of judgment, turning them into walking icons rather than people. In their hands they carried tomes bound in metal corners, pages thick with prayers and procedural checklists. One of them raised a staff topped with a censer, and the smoke thickened. "Be authority vested in sacred office," the lead cleric intoned, his voice amplified by a vox grill hidden beneath his mask. "This habitation zone is subject to purity procession and doctrinal reaffirmation. Resistance is deviation. Silence is obedience." The purity troopers fanned out, shock mauls humming softly at their sides. The sound was low and constant, like an insect trapped inside a skull. They moved door to door, stopping at each hab unit, gesturing for occupants to present themselves fully, visibly, correctly. When someone moved too slowly, a trooper's gauntlet would tap the floor once. When someone hesitated, the tap became a crackle. A man 2 doors down from me, an old scrap sorter with one eye clouded white, struggled to lower himself fully to his knees. His hands shook, joints stiff from years of labor. Before he could explain, a trooper struck him across the shoulder with the flat of the shock maul. The sound was wet and sharp. The man cried out, then forced himself down, forehead touching the floor. "Reverence is not optional," the cleric said, without looking at him. They chanted as they moved. Litanies that blurred scripture and threat into a single tone. Each phrase ended with the same response, barked by the troopers in unison. The words washed over us like waves, eroding resistance through repetition. I tried to empty my mind, to become still. I clasped my hands and bowed my head, reciting prayers I had known since childhood. I confessed silently small sins, large ones, imagined ones. I confessed impatience, resentment, doubt. I confessed things I was not sure were sins at all, just in case they had been reclassified. When the cleric reached me, he stopped. I felt his shadow fall over my bowed head, darker than the others. The incense burned my lungs as I inhaled too sharply. He did not speak at first. I heard the rustle of pages as he consulted his tome, the faint click of a data slate integrated into its spine. "Designation," he said. I gave it. "Devotional compliance during quarantine." "Yes," I said. My voice sounded small even to me. "Have you experienced intrusive thoughts inconsistent with approved doctrine?" The question was delivered flatly, as if asking about a mechanical fault. I hesitated, then answered truthfully, because truth felt safer than guessing. "I have experienced fear." The cleric tilted his head slightly. "Fear is acceptable," he said. "Clarify." "I fear failing the Emperor," I said quickly. "I fear impurity." That earned me a pause, a longer one this time. I felt sweat trickle down my spine, despite the cool metal under my knees. The cleric raised his stamp. I saw it clearly then, a heavy tool of brass and steel, its face engraved with sigils and tiny script. It was worn smooth around the edges from use. From impact, he pressed it against my chest, just below the collarbone, through my thin clothing. The metal was cold for a fraction of a second. Then he struck it with his palm. Pain exploded outward, a dull, crushing force that drove the breath from my lungs. I gasped, air scraping my throat, eyes watering uncontrollably. The stamp left no ink, but it left a mark, a deep bruise in the shape of the sigil, already swelling beneath my skin. "O diafaro eshiar reverdo," the cleric said. He moved on. I remained kneeling, heart hammering, lungs burning, the shape of the stamp throbbing in time with my pulse. Around me, others were marked the same way, some on the chest, some on the forehead, some across the back of the hand. Each impact was followed by a quiet cry, swallowed quickly in fear of reprisal. A few received different treatment. One woman screamed when the cleric examined her slate and shook his head. 2 troopers dragged her to her feet and forced her to stand before the assembly. The cleric recited a passage about contamination and mercy, his voice echoing in the corridor. Then the troopers struck her again and again with shock, mauls until she collapsed, convulsing, smoke rising from her clothing. "Removed from procession," the cleric declared. They dragged her away, leaving a dark smear on the floor. The procession lasted hours. Knees went numb, muscles cramp. The incense grew thicker, the air harder to breathe. Some people fainted and were shocked awake to resume their posture. Children were forced to kneel alongside adults, their whimpers punctuating the chant until a trooper silenced them with a look or a raised weapon. By the time the clerics reached the end of the corridor, the floor was dotted with bodies slumped forward in exhausted reverence. The chanting slowed, then stopped. The incense censers were closed, cutting off the smoke but leaving its residue clinging to everything. The lead cleric turned once, surveying us like a field assessed after harvest. "Purity is a process," he said. "Patience is proof." Then they marched away, iron boots receding, their rhythm fading into the hive's endless background noise. I lay on my side afterward, unable to rise immediately. My chest ached where the stamp had struck me, the bruise already darkening. Around me, others slowly moved, helping each other up in silence. No one spoke. Words felt dangerous now, too easily shaped into evidence. As I dragged myself back into my HAB unit, I understood something with terrible clarity. Confession did not cleanse us. Reverence did not save us. Compliance only prolonged the review. We were not being tested to pass. We were being processed to fail, at different speeds. And the stamp on my chest was not a warning. It was a placeholder. They came for me in the night cycle, when the hive's noises grew louder and more intimate, when pipes knocked like old bones and the ventilation moaned as if dreaming of failure. Night in the block was no longer a time of rest. It was a waiting room for footsteps. I had learned to measure sleep in fragments, 10 minutes of shallow unconsciousness, then a jolt awake at every distant clang. Each sound could have been them. Each pause in the corridor could have been my name being checked against a slate. I lay on my bunk, fully clothed, boots still on, ration chit folded and unfolded until the paper softened between my fingers. The bruise on my chest pulsed dully, a private metronome counting down something I could not see. When the knock came, it was gentle. That was the worst part, 3 taps on the metal door. Not a crash, not a demand, a polite request as if the person on the other side expected cooperation as a matter of course. I sat up immediately, heart hammering so hard I felt it in my throat. "Stand by," a voice said through the door. "Prepare for interview." Interview, such a clean word. I opened the door because that was what one did. Because doors that stayed closed were opened anyway, and the manner of opening was rarely improved by resistance. 2 figures stood outside, their forms outlined by the corridor's dim lumen strips. They were not Arbites nor clerics. Their clothing was utilitarian, dark coats reinforced at the seams, gloves sealed at the wrists. Their faces were hidden behind featureless masks, smooth and pale, with no expression carved into them at all. One of them held a hood. It was a black sack of coarse fabric, stiff with previous use, smelling faintly of old sweat and disinfectant. Before I could speak, before I could even ask the question that clawed at my tongue, the hood was pulled down over my head. Darkness swallowed the corridor, replaced by the rasp of my own breathing amplified inside the cloth. "Hands behind," the voice said. I complied. Cold restraints clicked around my wrists, not painfully tight, but firm enough to remind me of their presence. They guided me forward, their grips precise, impersonal. I stumbled once as my foot caught on the uneven floor, and one of them adjusted their hold to keep me upright. Not kindness, efficiency. The stairwell smelled different from the corridor, damp, mold and old metal. The scent of places rarely cleaned because they were rarely meant to be seen. Each step downward felt like a subtraction. I counted them without meaning to, the numbers slipping away from me after the first few dozen. My breathing grew shallow, the hood growing warmer with every exhale. We stopped. A door opened. Cooler air brushed my face through the fabric, carrying the sharp sting of antiseptic layered over something older. Blood, maybe. Or the memory of it. The hood was removed. I blinked against harsh white light, eyes watering. The room was small and deliberately bare. Metal walls, a table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs facing each other. One of them was occupied by a figure in a grey robe, seated perfectly straight, hands folded atop a data slate. The other chair, directly beneath a downward-facing lumen, was empty. I was guided into it. The restraints on my wrists were removed, but only because the table's edge pressed uncomfortably against my forearms, discouraging movement. The 2 masked figures stepped back and took positions near the door, becoming fixtures rather than participants. The robed figure looked at me. They did not introduce themselves. Names were unnecessary at this stage. "State your designation," they said. I did. They nodded once and tapped the slate. "This interview is part of an ongoing purity assessment. Your cooperation will be recorded. Inconsistencies will be addressed." Addressed. Another word that carried weight without detail. They began with questions I had already answered during the audit. My work schedule, my devotional habits, my known associates. I answered carefully, slowly, choosing each word as if it might explode if mishandled. The interrogator listened without expression, eyes flicking between me and the slate. Then they began again, the same questions, but altered slightly. A different order, a different emphasis, a minor detail inserted or removed. I felt my mind strained to keep everything aligned, to remember not just the truth, but the previously recorded truth. Sweat trickled down my temples. My mouth grew dry. "How many days did you miss devotional attendance in the last standard year? Which shrine did you attend during those absences? You stated earlier that you prayed at home. Clarify the discrepancy." I stopped myself, swallowed. I attended the communal shrine when possible. When ill, I prayed privately. They made a note. Describe the illness. I did. Who witnessed this illness? I hesitated. Illness was private. There were no witnesses. That realization felt like a trap snapping shut. No one. I said finally. I live alone. They looked at me for a long moment. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive. Somewhere behind the walls, I heard a distant scream cut short. Isolation increases susceptibility. The interrogator said mildly. They moved on. Hours passed, or minutes. It was impossible to tell without a clock. The questions repeated, circling tighter each time. Fatigue crept in, dulling the edges of my thoughts. I caught myself contradicting a minor detail, what time my shift ended on a particular day, the exact wording of a prayer verse. Each slip was noted, marked, added to the growing mass of data that was becoming me in their system. At some point, they slid a new slate across the table. Read, they said. It displayed a statement, my statement, compiled from my answers, formatted in dense blocks of text. I scanned it, heart sinking. It was mostly accurate, but subtly wrong in places. Timelines compressed, motivations inferred, doubt implied where I had expressed fear. This is not what I said, I whispered. It is consistent with what you provided. The interrogator replied. Confirm. I knew then that truth was no longer the measure. Consistency was. The slate did not care what had happened, only what could be reconciled with the rest of the record. My hand shook as I pressed my thumbprint to the confirmation pad. The interview ended without ceremony. No verdict was delivered. No reassurance offered. The interrogator simply stood, gathered their slate, and nodded to the masked figures. As they pulled the hood back over my head, I caught a glimpse of the other chair. Its surface was still warm. The imprint of someone else's body lingered there, faint but undeniable. The walk back up felt longer. My legs trembled, partly from exhaustion, partly from the weight of what I now understood. This was not about determining guilt. It was about refining a narrative until it could be filed cleanly. When they returned me to my HAB unit, they did not remove the mark on my chest. They did not explain what would come next. The door closed with a soft click that sounded far too final for such a small motion. I sat on the bunk and stared at the wall until the light cycle changed. My mind replayed the questions, the moments I had hesitated, the places where my answers had bent under pressure. Somewhere, those bends were being catalogued. I learned that night what truth truly was in the Imperium. Truth was not what you remembered. Truth was not what you intended. Truth was what survived the paperwork. And somewhere below me, in a room that smelled of antiseptic and old blood, my truth had already been edited. They did not tell us it was over. That was the first sign that it wasn't mercy. The quarantine gates remained sealed, the warning sigils unaltered, the public vox still murmuring its calm, hollow reassurances. But something in the block shifted after the interviews. The nights grew quieter, not because fear had lessened, but because there were fewer voices left to make noise. Doors that had once rattled with coughing or whispered arguments now stood mute, their occupants removed so completely it was as if they had never existed. On the third day after my interview, the Vox ordered us to assemble. All remaining residents of HAB, Block K, 17 will report to the Central Concourse. Attendance is mandatory. Failure to comply will be recorded as willful deviation. The Central Concourse was a wide, circular space once meant for transit overflow and communal announcements. I remembered it from before, when it had been loud with foot traffic and stale laughter, when vendors sold fried ration scraps from illicit grills and children chased each other beneath the faded mural on the ceiling. Now it was bare. The vendors were gone. The grills cold. The mural, depicting a saintly figure raising a stylized sun, was cracked down the center, a fracture running straight through the painted face. We gathered beneath it in rows, herded by Arbites who said nothing but made their expectations clear through posture alone. Boots aligned us into neat lines, shoulder to shoulder, close enough to feel each other's heat. The air was cooler here, scrubbed by higher capacity vents, and that made the smell of fear sharper, less diluted. I stood between two people I barely knew anymore. Hunger had hollowed their faces. Bruises bloomed openly now, on throats, wrists, temples, marks of procedures conducted without witnesses. No one spoke. Even prayers felt dangerous. A platform had been erected at the center of the concourse, metal bolted hastily into place. Upon it stood a lectern, a scroll case, and a firing line. That was when I understood. A robbed official stepped forward, flanked by armed troopers whose weapons were already raised at rest position. The official's voice was unaugmented, but it carried easily in the hushed space. By review of collected data, they began, the quarantine of this habitation zone has concluded. A ripple went through the crowd, hope, sharp and painful. The official raised a hand. Resolution has been achieved. The scroll was opened, names were read. Not shouted, not emphasized, just spoken one after another, in the same tone used to read inventory lists and shift assignments. Each name was followed by a brief justification, delivered with bureaucratic precision, non-compliant posture during reverence, unverified catechism revision, associative proximity to confirmed anomaly, excessive variance in testimony. I felt sick as I recognized some of them. A man who had shared ration water with me during the first day of quarantine. A woman whose child had cried in the corridor at night until she sang to them softly. A laborer who had laughed at the notice, believing it temporary. They were led forward calmly, guided onto the platform in groups of 3. Their hands were bound. Some looked dazed, others rigid with terror. One tried to speak, to shout something, innocence, devotion, I don't know, but a trooper struck him behind the knee and forced him down. The executions were clean. The troopers raised their weapons, aimed with practiced precision, and fired. The sound was sharp and contained, the smell immediate, burned flesh and ozone. Bodies fell where they stood, tagged instantly by servitors that rolled forward from hidden alcoves, mechanical arms already reaching to affix identification markers. I watched a friend die. I will not write his name here. The Imperium has already decided it is unnecessary. His head snapped back at the impact, and for a fraction of a second his face was peaceful, relieved even. That was the moment my soul recoiled, not in horror, but in envy. His ordeal was complete, his record closed. No more reviews, no more waiting. The worst part was what came next. The official turned back to us and spoke the final words of the procedure. These actions serve as corrective example. Let all remaining residents observe the consequences of deviation and be reassured by the Imperium's commitment to purity. There was a pause, then someone clapped, one person somewhere near the back, a single hesitant sound. Another followed, then another. Applause spread, uneven at first, then steadier. I felt my own hands rise, driven by instinct, by terror, by the need to be seen performing the correct response. I clapped. The sound echoed in the concourse, obscene and loud. Fear learning how to sound like devotion. When it was over, the bodies were gone, the platform dismantled. The mural still cracked above us. The official left without another word. The Arbites remained, watching as we were dismissed in orderly rows, survivors of a lesson we would never forget. As I returned to my HAB unit, legs trembling, I realized the quarantine had not ended with release. It had ended with subtraction, and the ledger, finally balanced for now, would remember only that the correction had been made. They waited just long enough for us to believe survival had been granted. That was the final cruelty. The executions ended the spectacle, not the process. For a handful of hours, perhaps a full cycle, perhaps less, the block existed in a fragile, trembling quiet. The public vox fell silent. The Arbites withdrew from the corridor junctions. Even the ventilation seemed to steady, its coughs smoothing into a low, exhausted wheeze. People moved carefully, reverently, like mourners afraid to disturb the dead. I remember thinking, foolishly, that this might be the end of it, that those of us left had been deemed acceptable enough, that the ledger had closed. Then the vox returned. Its voice was different this time. Lower, slower, weighted with ritual emphasis rather than administrative calm. Attention. HAB Block K-17 has been designated irrecoverable, initiating full cleansing protocol. This action is merciful. This action is necessary. I did not understand at first. My mind rejected the words the way a body rejects poison. Irrecoverable was a term I had heard before, used for machinery beyond economical repair, for data corrupted past redundancy. It was not a word meant for people. The floor trembled beneath my feet. A deep, resonant vibration rolled through the block, followed by the grinding roar of heavy mechanisms engaging. Somewhere above us, far above, massive doors began to move. I heard the sound of ceiling plates sliding into place, layer upon layer, isolating our level from the rest of the hive. Each impact echoed like a hammer strike against a coffin lid. Panic erupted, finally unleashed. People ran. Not toward exits, those had been sealed long ago, but in frantic, directionless bursts, slamming into doors, pounding walls, screaming names that no longer answered. I ran too, driven by reflex more than hope, clutching my devotional slate to my chest like a talisman that might suddenly remember how to save me. Then the heat came. It began as a wave, a sudden rise in temperature that turned the air thick and oppressive. The smell followed seconds later. Promethium. Acrid, oily, unmistakable. Flame units had been deployed. I saw them at the far end of the corridor, armored figures advancing methodically, carrying heavy nozzles connected to fuel tanks that hissed and rattled with each step. Their armor was marked with cleansing sigils and hazard stripes, their visors opaque and inhuman. They did not hurry. There was no need. The first gout of flame roared down the corridor, a living wall of fire that devoured everything it touched. Paint blistered and peeled. Plastic fixtures warped and sagged. Shrines ignited instantly, their sacred oils feeding the blaze until icons melted into puddles of gold and black sludge that ran along the floor like tears. The heat slammed into me, stealing breath, forcing a scream from my throat. I turned and ran, boots slipping on condensation and debris, lungs burning as the air grew thinner, fouler. The fire made a sound like laughter, deep, hungry, endless. People died screaming. Some collapsed where they stood, overcome by heat and smoke before the flames reached them. Others beat at doors with bloody hands, flesh blistering, voices rising into shrill, wordless terror. I saw a man throw himself at a purity-marked bulkhead until his shoulder shattered, his bones cracking audibly beneath the roar of fire. The Vox continued to speak, its voice cutting through the chaos with infuriating clarity. Remain calm. This is an act of protection. The greater hive endures. I ducked into a side passage, coughing violently, eyes streaming. The walls here were lined with old data, slates, and broken equipment. Forgotten storage turned into refuge by desperation. Smoke rolled along the ceiling, thick and black, tasting of melted insulation and burning flesh. Each breath felt like swallowing knives. I stumbled over something soft and fell hard. My hands sank into fabric, then skin, a body, already dead. I pushed myself up, gagging, and kept moving. Somewhere above, machinery ground relentlessly. I realized then what they were doing. The hive was sealing itself, compartment by compartment, isolating the fire to ensure it did not spread upward. Our level was being turned into a furnace, a contained incident, a controlled burn. We were not being punished. We were being erased. I ran past my HAB unit without thinking, past the door where I had slept, prayed, waited. Flames licked the corridor behind me, casting wild shadows that made the warning sigils writhe like living things. The bruise on my chest throbbed painfully, the stamped sigil burning as if the mark itself were being activated. I found a maintenance shaft near the end of the block, its access panel hanging loose. Smoke poured from it, but less thickly than the corridor. I crawled inside, scraping my arms and knees raw on metal grating, pulling the panel shut behind me just as fire washed past. Inside it was darkness and heat, and the endless clatter of pipes expanding under stress. I crawled blindly, guided only by the faintest draft of cooler air. My lungs screamed, my vision narrowed. Every movement felt like wading through molten lead. I do not know how long I crawled. Time dissolved into pain and instinct. Eventually, the shaft ended at a vertical drop, a refused chute half clogged with debris. Below, I could feel cooler air rising. I did not hesitate. The fall knocked the breath from me and cracked something in my ribs. I lay there gasping, surrounded by ash and filth, the chute walls warm but no longer burning. Above me, the roar of fire faded into a distant, muted thunder. I had escaped the flames. That did not mean I had survived. Hours later, perhaps longer, I emerged into a lower service level, coughing black phlegm, my skin blistered, my clothes ruined. Around me, others stumbled out of hidden routes, maintenance ways, refused ducts, those few who had found places the cleansing protocol had not fully reached. We looked at each other with hollow eyes and said nothing. Above us, the hive continued its work. Doors sealed, vents purged, Flames consumed everything we had been. By the time the fire died, there would be nothing left but slag and ash, and a neatly filed report stating that Hab, Block K-17 had been successfully cleansed. I realized then how completely the Imperium could destroy a place without ever acknowledging the people inside it. The Hive would not mourn us. The Ledger would not remember us. We would exist only as a resolved problem, and yet, somehow, I was still breathing. I write this because writing is the only labor they have left me that resembles a voice. The slate I use is chipped and scorched at the edges, salvaged from a processing pile marked non-functional but legible. That designation applies to me as well, I think. I am alive in the way misprinted documents are alive, present, inconvenient, awaiting reassignment. My hands shake when I hold the stylus. The skin is blistered, peeling in places. The burns weeping faintly no matter how often I bind them. The pain is constant now, dull and thorough, like a background noise that never switches off. They call this mercy. After the fire, after the smoke thinned and the screams stopped echoing in my head, we were gathered by those who survived the cleansing. Not many of us. A handful dragged from ducts, refused chutes, forgotten service tunnels, those overlooked by protocol, not spared by design. We were herded into a lower transit hall that smelled of wet ash and disinfectant, its walls newly scrubbed to remove evidence of what had fallen through them. A clerk met us there, not an Arbites, not a cleric, just a clerk robed in stained parchment-colored cloth, his eyes red, rimmed from long hours and recyc air. He carried a slate and a portable stamping unit, its metal face already blackened from use. He did not look at us as people. He looked at us as items delayed in transit. Remain orderly, he said. You have been reassigned. Another clean word. We were processed in silence. Names taken, those that still matched records. Biometrics scanned. Injuries noted with the same tone one might use to log cosmetic damage on equipment. No condolences. No acknowledgement of loss. The Hive had no place in its procedures for mourning. When my turn came, the clerk paused, frowning at his slate. Hab block origin, he asked. K-17, I said. He winced just slightly, not in sympathy, in annoyance. That designation is closed, he replied. Updated classification cleansed zone. You are reassigned as salvage labor, pending lifespan assessment. He stamped my slate. The sound echoed louder than any gunshot. Salvage labor is what remains when usefulness and punishment intersect. It is the work of those who cannot be trusted to rejoin the Hive's flow, but are too valuable to waste outright. We are sent back into the dead places, into zones declared resolved, to sift through what remains. Ash, twisted metal, fragments of lives reduced to debris. They marched us back up through secured routes, once the fires were certified extinguished. The air was still warm, still tasted of smoke and chemical suppressant. Where my block had been, there was no corridor anymore, only a blackened cavity sealed behind hazard plating. Through inspection slits, I could see the aftermath. Walls slumped inward, floors warped into ripples, everything coated in a fine grey dust that clung to skin and cloth alike. That dust was my home. We worked in shifts dictated by oxygen limits and radiation tolerances. Servitors oversaw us, their flesh grafted into frames designed for tireless observation. They did not speak, only chimed when quotas were not met. We shoveled ash into containers. We sorted metal by grade. We catalogued remains without naming them. Sometimes I recognized things. A melted devotional icon, its features blurred but still faintly familiar. A child's toy reduced to a warped loop of plastic and wire. A fragment of a door plate with half a number still visible. Each time, I felt something inside me recoil, then harden. Grief was inefficient. The Imperium had trained me well enough to know that. My lungs burn constantly now. Every breath tastes of smoke and metal, as if the fire never truly went out inside me. At night, when night is permitted, I cough until my chest spasms, my ribs aching where something cracked during my escape. Medical attention is logged as unnecessary. My projected output remains within acceptable parameters. I am correct enough to keep. That is the great lie the Imperium teaches you, that correctness is salvation. That if you follow the litanies, file the forms, bow at the right moments, you will be spared. I was correct. I worked my shifts. I prayed when instructed. I confessed when demanded. I complied. It did not matter. My heresy was not thought or deed. It was location. I existed in the wrong block when the seal was pressed. I breathed the wrong air. I shared walls with the wrong neighbors. That was sufficient. Sometimes, when the work slows and the servitors are recalibrating, I allow myself to remember the concourse as it was, the sound of footsteps, the smell of illicit food, the laughter that echoed too loudly. I remember the notice on the bulkhead, the wax seal bleeding in the heat, the corrected ink line that almost saved us. Almost. I do not expect absolution anymore. Absolution is not a function the Imperium provides. It processes, it categorizes, it repurposes. When something no longer fits, it is removed, burned, and logged as resolved. This account is my final deviation. I know it will be found. I know it will be filed, perhaps under post-incident testimony, perhaps under irrelevant material. It will not change anything. The Hive will continue. New blocks will be built. New notices will be posted. The machinery will grind on, perfect in its indifference. But if you are reading this, if my words have slipped through some crack in the system, know this: I tried to be correct, and correctness did not save me.